10 Harsh Realities of Rewatching Star Trek: The Next Generation. Season 1 today, Star Trek: The Next Generation eventually became one of the best science fiction television shows of all time, but it did not get off to a very strong start in Season 1. TNG ushered in a new golden era of Star Trek, introducing the world to Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart, and the crew of the USS Enterprise D, with stories recycled from Star Trek, the original series, and cliches that were outdated even in the 1980s. Many of TNG's early episodes fell flat. Thankfully, fans stuck with the show, and it went on to produce some truly great television. As the first live-action Star Trek show since the end of Star Trek, the original series, many fans were weary of Star Trek: The Next Generation from the start. People were not sure how a Star Trek show would work without Captain James T. Kirk, William Shatner, Mr. Spock, Leonard Nimoy, and Dr. McCoy, DeForest Kelley. While Star Trek: The Next Generation's characters showed promise from the beginning, many of them were not fully developed in TNG's first season. By TNG Season 2 and beyond, Captain Picard and his crew began to feel like a family and became the characters fans came to love. But Star Trek: The Next Generation Season 1 had issues. Although fans were unaware at the time, Star Trek: The Next Generation would lead to over a decade of new Star Trek shows set in the 24th century. No new live-action Star Trek had aired on television since the conclusion of Star Trek, the original series, in 1969, and fans desperately wanted more Trek. While TNG faced some backlash for introducing an entirely new cast of characters, the show did well enough in the ratings to warrant a second season. If TNG Season 1 had aired today, the show likely would not have made it past one season. Paramount Studios chose to broadcast TNG as a first-run syndication show, which was basically unheard of in the 1980s. This means that the show aired on numerous networks simultaneously rather than on one specific channel, like CBS or NBC. After TNG's feature-length premiere, Encounter at Farpoint, did well in the ratings, the studios agreed to produce a full 23-episode season. Despite the fact that Gene Roddenberry wanted Star Trek: The Next Generation to distinguish itself from Star Trek: The Original Series, TNG Season 1 borrowed several story ideas from TOS. Most obviously, TNG Season 1 Episode 3, The Naked Now, is a direct sequel to TOS Season 1 Episode 4, The Naked Time. Between its derivative plot and cringe-worthy moments, TNG's take on the story simply doesn't work. One of Star Trek's worst episodes, TNG Season 1, Episode 4, Code of Honor, borrows many of the worst cliches from TOS, including a cheesy fight to the death and questionable gender roles. The following episode, The Last Outpost, is most remembered for introducing the Ferengi, but it has a similar plot to the Star Trek: The Original Series' Arena, without being as good as that classic episode. Much of the inconsistency of early Star Trek: The Next Generation is the result of a writing staff in constant flux. TNG even gained a reputation in Hollywood for having a particularly chaotic writer's room, as writers were constantly coming and going. Aging and in poor health, Gene Roddenberry was reportedly becoming more difficult to work with, as he often insisted on rewriting perfectly fine scripts and inserting unnecessary scenes. Star Trek: The Next Generation, TNG, remains a monumental achievement in the science fiction genre, remembered fondly by fans for its thought-provoking stories, charismatic crew, and timeless exploration of human and societal themes. However, the first season, which aired in 1987, doesn't exactly represent the series at its best. While it's still a landmark in TV history, rewatching Season 1 today can reveal certain flaws and limitations that might be hard for modern audiences to overlook. Here are 10 harsh realities of revisiting Star Trek: The Next Generation's debut season. 1. Awkward character development. One of the immediate challenges of watching Season 1 is the awkwardness in how the characters are portrayed. Many of the personalities that would later become iconic, Captain Picard's steady leadership, Data's pursuit of humanity, Riker's charm, are still in rough shape. Picard, for instance, often comes across as unnecessarily harsh and standoffish, a far cry from the measured diplomat fans came to love. Meanwhile, Riker's first officer swagger and relationship with the rest of the crew feel underdeveloped. Watching the cast try to find their footing is sometimes more painful than entertaining. 2. outdated special effects even for its time. Star Trek: The Next Generation had a limited budget, and Season 1 special effects reflect that. In an era of modern CGI and visually stunning productions, the practical effects, miniatures, and basic space visuals from the late 1980s can seem primitive. Some of the alien planets, space battles, and even the representation of the ship's interiors, with awkward lighting and bare sets, feel jarringly simple compared to contemporary standards. 3. Inconsistent writing. Season 1 of TNG is riddled with inconsistency, largely because the series was still trying to figure out its voice. Some episodes are brilliant, such as The Big Goodbye, offering the kind of philosophical and moral dilemmas Star Trek excels at. But others feel poorly thought out, relying on tropes or plot lines that haven't aged well. Take the episode Code of Honor, which is now widely criticized for its uncomfortable racial stereotypes and simplistic portrayal of an alien culture. The disparity in episode quality is hard to ignore when binge-watching. 4. Worf's reduced role. If you're a fan of Worf, prepare to be disappointed in Season 1. The character who would become the series' honorable and formidable Klingon warrior is relegated to the background for most of the season. His development into one of the most beloved characters doesn't start until later seasons. In Season 1, Worf often feels like an extra with few lines, and his potential is only occasionally hinted at. 5. Stilted dialogue. One of the more jarring elements of early TNG is its dialogue. Characters often speak in an overly formal or wooden style, making their interactions feel forced or unnatural. The bridge crew is frequently engaged in expository dialogue, and there's a noticeable lack of the camaraderie and humor that would later define the ensemble cast. Moments that are meant to be profound often come across as clunky due to this overly stilted way of speaking. 6. Wesley Crusher overload. Wesley Crusher, the young, brilliant son of Dr. Beverly Crusher, is one of the more divisive elements of Season 1. Played by Will Wheaton, Wesley was intended to appeal to a younger audience, but his frequent saves of the day and his general presence as the precocious genius don't sit well with all viewers. His overuse in the first season, especially when more seasoned crew members are sidelined, can be frustrating to watch today. It's hard not to feel like the writers overestimated the audience's desire for a child prodigy on the bridge. 7. The absence of later fan favorites. If you're coming into Season 1 expecting TNG to be packed with your favorite characters and plotlines, you'll be sorely disappointed. There's no Guinan, no Ensign Ro, and the Borg, one of TNG's most iconic villains, are completely absent. The absence of these later elements can make Season 1 feel underwhelming, especially for viewers who are rewatching after falling in love with later seasons. 8. Weird costumes and makeup. The 1980s influence on the show's design is undeniable, and nowhere is it more evident than in the costumes and makeup. From Counselor Troy's impractical jumpsuits to the less than convincing alien prosthetics, Season 1 feels dated in the wardrobe department. The frequent use of shiny fabrics and impractical space uniforms sometimes distracts from the narrative, making it harder for modern viewers to take some characters seriously. 9. Sexism and dated social attitudes. While Star Trek has always been progressive in certain areas, Season 1 of TNG struggles with outdated social attitudes. Female characters like Troy and Yar are often written into stereotypical roles. Troy, the ship's counselor, spends much of her time delivering emotional insights while wearing inappropriate skin-tight outfits, and Yar, the head of security, is often portrayed more as a tough archetype than a fully fleshed-out character. It's frustrating to see the potential of these women sidelined by the limitations of 1980s gender norms.